Hey, it's Brian Bennett with Multiply Leaders. I'm a pastor and I'm also the founder of Multiply Leaders, a resourcing, coaching, and consulting organization whose purpose and passion is to help leaders unlock their potential and multiply their influence in Jesus' name. I'll take a minute to talk to you about the gap. The gap is the distance between our inner and our outer world. So thinking about this for a moment, the gap is the distance between who we are in public and who we are in private. If there's a great space between those two realities, then that means there's a significant gap. If there's a small space between them, then there's a little gap. But all of us have a gap. The difference between the gifts that we have and the character that we have. If there's a gap, and let's just say we're really high gifted, but our character is low, there's a significant gap there. The more that our gifts and our character move together as we develop them, the better. And the more that there's a distance between them, whether our character is really high but our gifts are really low, that means that we're a solid person, but we're not going to go far in our vocation. If we can move our gifts and our character together, then the gap is small, and we want a small gap. The distance between our emotions and our awareness of our emotions, right? Whatever gap is there between what's happening inside of us, what our bodies are feeling, and what level of awareness we have of that. The greater the gap between our emotions and our awareness, the more likely we are to outburst in a meeting, the more likely we are to get frustrated with a person over something small because of the real issue we're not addressing or talking about. The more likely we are to be driven by emotions that we are unaware of, that are under the surface, but they're showing up in actions and words and attitude, and sometimes that can get us stuck and maybe even move us out of a team or an organization because our emotions are driving us and the effect of people isn't positive. The gap between our care for others and our self-care. This is a significant gap because it looks good to care for others, to be a servant leader, to pay attention to the needs for others. But if we're not caring for ourselves first with exercise, with our diet, by staying hydrated, by paying attention to our own replenishment cycle, then we can start caring for others to our own detriment. And it looks good, and that's the dangerous point of this one, is that we can care for others right into burnout. And I've been there and done that before. So the gap between our care for others and our self-care, we don't want a big gap. We want our care for others and our self-care to be close to each other. The gap between what we do and what we know we should do. Right, leadership requires courage, and sometimes we know what we should do, but we don't have the courage, or we're not willing to step into action in the midst of our fear, so we don't have the courage to do what we know we should do. When there's a significant gap between what we do and what we know we should do, which is happening inside of us. Now, sometimes our teammates are going to see this gap, and they're going to get disillusioned with our leadership because they know that we know what we should do, or they know what should be done, and we may not realize that they are sensing and feeling that. The greater this gap, the more it's going to hurt us as a leader. It's going to hurt the teams that we lead. It's going to hurt the organizations that we lead. It might hurt our marriage relationship if what we know we should do and what we do. Right? If those gaps are significant, it's going to hurt us as a parent. It can hurt us what we know we should do, how we should interact with our children, and what we do in a friendship, and when there's a tension, what we know we should do, what we do. So we want to make sure that that gap is very small. And lastly, the gap between what we say and what we're thinking. So many times we don't always say what we think, and we hold back, but inside we might be having one conversation, and externally we're having another conversation, and that gap, the distance between what we're thinking and what we're saying, we don't want that gap to get too big. We want to be people who are graciously honest with our team, with each other, and our spouse, with our children, with whoever, friendship. We want to live honest, authentic lives with others in a way that doesn't crush or wound on purpose, but in a way that is graciously truthful and authentic with them. So think about what other gaps might exist in your life, and that's what those last two lines are for, because there's many ways that we can think about this. And what we want, the reason this is so significant, why we want to talk about this, is because the greater this distance, the more it hurts us. The smaller this distance, the more that we thrive as leaders. So here are three truths for us. The first one is this: is everybody has a gap. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter how long you've been leading or living. Everyone has a gap in some form, in some way. And for most of us, we have a lot of gaps as we look at our life. But all of us have a gap. We're not perfect. Second thing is unawareness, or a lack of awareness of our gap, equals danger. When we're not aware of the gap between who we are in public and who we are in private, when we're not aware of the gap between our gifts being really high and our character being really low, or vice versa, it's dangerous because we don't know to work on it then. We don't know to develop. We don't know to take some action or get some coaching, bring some people around us to help us grow and develop. So the second thing, unawareness of a gap equals danger. The third truth with gaps is the greater the gap, the greater the danger. The greater the gap, the greater the danger. And sometimes we see a friend or someone that we love and care about, or we see it in our own life. They climb so high in their influence, in their ministry, in their workplace, in their business, in their marriage, but there's a secret inner life and a public outer life. There's a big disconnect, and then somehow, some way, it comes to the surface, and they lose it. They lose that position. They lose that relationship. And it doesn't always have to be that extreme. That's kind of an intense example. But for many of us, we get passed over with a promotion because the gap is too big. Or our friendships don't flourish because the gap is too big. Or our marriage is stuck because the gap is too big in some form, some way. The fourth truth is this. We close the gap with inside-out leadership. Here's what inside-out leadership is all about. The gap is always going to be there, but what we're working towards is as small as gap as possible. As a follower of Jesus Christ, my perspective, this side of heaven, we're never going to close that gap completely. But what we want to do is move towards a closed gap. We want to move towards as little of a gap as we possibly can. And that's a day-to-day reality. That's a season-to-season reality of our life. And so we close the gap with inside-out leadership, meaning this, is that we take care of ourselves and we lead ourselves before we seek to lead others. That's the first part of inside-out leadership. We lead ourselves before we lead others. It might sound good if you were doing a life plan to put your children above your own self-care, soul care. But what happens ultimately, if we put everyone else before ourselves in that sense of the word, we're really not putting them before ourselves because we're not bringing our best to them. What we have to do is be intentional about the things that are going to help us serve others well. So we've got to take care of ourselves physically, emotionally, socially, mentally, spiritually, vocationally, in every single way. We've got to be disciplined about replenishing ourselves so that we can bring our best to our families, to our children, to our friendships, to our work, to our churches, to our communities. And so we've got to be intentional about self-leadership first before we seek to lead others. The second key to close the gap with inside-out leadership is we lead from the inside of our lives to the external. So we lead from our homes into our workplaces, into our communities. Instead of thinking about just going and being at work and that being somehow disconnected from our home life, whatever your home life looks like, or being disconnected from who we are in the community, we seek to lead from the inside out versus the outside in. So we don't start off with who we are at work and then lead home. We start off with the home and who we are there and our closest relationships that we're in every single day. And then we think about leading out from there into our workplace and from our workplace into our community. So inside out leadership is how we close the gap. First, by leading ourselves before we seek to lead anyone else, by taking care of ourselves before we seek to take care of anyone else, and then from leading from the most intimate, closest relationships in our home life outward into our workplaces and beyond. Whatever that might mean for you, some of you might live alone, and whatever that looks like in your closest, most intimate relationships in your life, whether that's your friends or maybe it starts with your coworkers, but it's inside out. It starts with the us, and then it moves to others, and it keeps going to the exterior of our lives. This has been a Coaching Corner, Multiply Leaders lead coach and consultant Brian Bennett. We're here to help and support you. If you want to close the gap, reach out to us. Head over to multiplyleaders.co. We would love to join you on that journey.